Hello everyone and welcome to today's ARI seminar. Fantastic to have you all online with us. Of course, today our seminar is brought to you by the Victoria Nature Festival. I hope you've all been enjoying things. There's so many things happening around the Nature Festival. Jump out there, get online, go for the Great Vic Nature Walk, do all of those things. There's lots happening. We'll probably put in the chat at some point a link to the Nature Festival so you can find out all the many things that are on. It's we're midway through and it's terrific. So welcome to today's, which is brought to you by the Nature Festival and of course brought to you by ARI. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge I'm joining you from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people. I pay my respects to those traditional owners and any elders past and present and those emerging and all those on the different lands on which you are meeting right across the state and potentially beyond. I'd like to also acknowledge that I'm observing that it's poor neat season now on Kulin Nations. I've seen tadpoles appearing. I've seen many rivers full of a lot of rain, a wide range of orchids starting to appear. So it's clearly poor neat season for Kulin Nations people. And that's one way of observing the world around us and perhaps monitoring the world. And we're going to hear some different versions of that from our speakers today. We've got Geoff Heard and Justin Tully speaking with us today. Thanks to both of those speakers. We're going to start with Geoff, who I think will be well known to many of you, and it's an absolute delight for us to see Geoff back again. Geoff, an absolute legend really, more than 20 years of experience on threatened species. I think he started at La Trobe on threatened frogs with a PhD, then a couple of postdocs at Melbourne Uni. He's been at Charles Sturt. He was, of course, a very treasured member of ARI staff with us for a while. That's great to see him back. But now he's with the University of Queensland and TERN working on the Threatened Species Index. We're all curious about this and we're going to hear about it now. Thanks so much, Geoff. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Fern, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for coming along. It looks like we've got fantastic attendance, and it's a delight to be back with ARI and being involved with the Institute. So thanks so much for the invite. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Bear with me. I'm always slow at this. Okay, I'm hoping you can now see my screen. I'm going to flick to slide mode. Is that all good?
Great, Geoff. It's all good. Yep.
Okay, fantastic. So my task today, as Fern mentioned, is to tell you all about the Threatened Species Index, of which I am the project manager. Before I get into that, I'd like to acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal people, who are the traditional owners of the land on which the University of Queensland sits, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. The Threatened Species Index is a project which has been running now since 2018, and its objective is to allow us to understand the long-term trends of our threatened species. And so my task today really is to introduce you to the index, give you a bit of an insight into what it is, how it works, and to encourage you to get involved with the TSX. We're always looking to expand our data sets, and there's many of you that will be in the audience that have data sets that we would love to integrate into the index. We're always looking to expand and build the representation of threatened species in the index. First, I'm going to just tell you what the index is. So fundamentally, the index is a database of thousands of threatened species monitoring projects from right across Australia. And ultimately a quantitative index that measures changes in the abundance of Australia's threatened and near threatened species. For those of you that are familiar with the index, this is probably what you have seen. This is our web portal where you can go on and interrogate and explore our data sets to look at the trends in the abundance of, at the moment, mammals, birds and plants, which are the three groups that we have in the index at the moment. We're looking to expand into the future. But there's much more to the index than just this web portal. But that's our ultimate objective, is to publish annually trends in our threatened species based upon the long-term data that we have gathered from right across the country. Before I get into the index in further detail, I just wanted to give you 3 value propositions as to the importance of the index and why it was created, and why we view it now as a really crucial part of Australia's environmental data infrastructure. So the first value proposition, and I'll go into these further, is that long-term data is really crucial for measuring the success of threatened species programs, and I'll break that down in a moment. Secondly, that Australia's threatened species monitoring data has traditionally been quite fragmented and dispersed. Australians are great at going out and monitoring threatened species, but we haven't had a really systematic effort previously to bring that data together to tell us about trends. So that third value proposition really is drawing all of that long-term monitoring data to enable us to estimate the trends of our threatened species and ultimately gather whether we are winning or not in our pursuit to conserve these species. Okay, so firstly, the importance of long-term monitoring data. It's really crucial for making robust decisions around conservation. Without it, it is impossible to gauge whether our activities and our investments are working. Likewise, without knowing the success or otherwise of our programs, it's impossible to adapt our efforts as required to ensure that we are getting the best efficacy out of our efforts. And a point that I'd just like to draw out a bit is that long-term data is really crucial for these things. Short-term monitoring is quite useful for answering very specific questions, but it's really that long-term data that we need to make accurate assessments of our conservation success. And there are various reasons for that, of course, but one of the reasons is the dynamic nature of populations, the impact of stochastic events, etc. There's a lot of noise in the population dynamics of species and threatened species that we need to account for, and long-term data is really crucial for that. But there's also lags in the effects of different impacts, and also our management. So we need that long-term data to ensure that we're getting a clear picture about what's happening with our threatened species. And I'm going to illustrate this point with growling grass frog. So many of you in the audience will not be surprised that I've managed to winkle in growling grass frogs into this talk. They're a species I've been working on now for many years, and this is them. You can see why I've been working on them for so long. They're a truly spectacular frog. I've been working on them with colleagues at ARI and Melbourne Uni and other places for about 20 years, and monitoring them north of Melbourne, so the Merri Creek catchment, Darabin Creek catchment, and the Moonee Ponds Creek catchment. And the data that we've accrued gives us the ability now to look at the long-term trends in this frog species, and it gives you some insights into why long-term data is really valuable. So we started monitoring this frog in 2001, 2002, and at that time we monitor the number of sites that are occupied. So that's our metric of population change. In that first year, out of our set of around about 200 sites, around about 88 of those were occupied. If we'd monitored for the subsequent 5 years after that initial survey, we would have inferred that there was a decline in occupancy, but not particularly severe, a slight decline in occupancy over that time period. But if we'd started monitoring in 2006, 2007 instead of that initial year 0102 and monitored for a subsequent 4 years, we would have got a very different picture about how growling grass frogs were doing across northern Melbourne. We would have thought they're probably doing okay. They're either stable or perhaps even increasing. The long-term data tells us that in fact the frog is declining quite precipitously, and we've just gone back and redone our surveys last summer and discovered that the species has really declined precipitously in the last 5 or 6 years. And La Nina has a part to play in that, but also those lags that I mentioned in development effects, so that we're seeing now lots of extinctions, rapid extinctions that we didn't see previously. So that's just a sort of brief window into why long-term data is really crucial for monitoring our threatened species and understanding how they're doing and what we need to do to conserve them. The next point, as I mentioned, Australia's monitoring data is really fragmented and dispersed. Australians are great at doing lots of monitoring of our biodiversity and threatened species. However, these surveys rarely extend into long-term monitoring projects, and without projects like the TSX, we can't accrue those time series. They sit in people's hard drives, in filing cabinets, in honours theses, etc. So it's really crucial that we bring them together. And just to highlight that point around the short-term nature of individual monitoring projects in Australia, is this is the data from our 2020 release of the index. And whilst we've managed to accrue almost 20,000 monitoring data sets, most of those are quite short-term, less than 10 years. The majority are less than 10 years in length. Very few are greater than 20 years. And you can see that there's a big spike around about 3 or 4 years. So we tend to do a lot of monitoring in Australia that's of that short duration, 3 to 4 to 5 years of monitoring. So they're all valuable data, but we really need to bring them together to inform our long-term trends and understand how species are doing. The other problem we've had historically in Australia is that there's been little coordination of projects. Lots going on, lots of different organisations, state level, regional level, local council level, etc. But there hasn't been, up until this point, a centralised repository to bring all of those data together. So that's what the TSX aims to do. And the reason we do that is to estimate these long-term trends. So in the Northern Hemisphere, the UK, Europe, North America have had this capacity to estimate trends in biodiversity for many years because they've had long-term monitoring data and they've had centralised repositories to bring that data together to estimate trends. And so the TSX really aimed to achieve that for Australia, for threatened species at least. So prior to us, we had no means of assessing overall species trends, no means of reporting on species trends, and no ability to demonstrate progress towards state, national and international obligations at that broad level. I'm talking here not about single species trends, but at these broad multi-species trends, biodiversity trends. And so we're thrilled now that the TSX has for the first time been able to contribute to the State of the Environment report. So this was a major objective for the TSX when it was originally set up. Yeah, for the first time, the State of the Environment report has been able to report on trends in abundance of our threatened birds, mammals and plants. And this will be now a mainstay, hopefully, of State of the Environment reports going forward, and we can include other species groups in this as we bring them into the index. Okay, so that's a bit of a spiel on why we exist and why we think the TSX is important. I just wanted to give you a very brief history of where we came from. So the TSX was born out of the Threatened Species Recovery Hub, which was a major hub of the National Environmental Science Program. It specifically came out of the hub at UQ. It was a brainchild of Hugh Possingham. It was an objective of his for a long time to bring threatened species monitoring data together to produce an index of this kind. And it was the product of tireless work by 3 postdocs at UQ, and I just wanted to pay tribute to those 3 people. So firstly, Dr. Elisa Bayraktarov, Dr. Aisha Tulloch, and Dr. Misha Jackson. So they worked, as I say, tirelessly to bring this project to fruition. It had 3 incarnations previously, so it started out life as the Threatened Bird Index in 2018, and this was a collaboration with BirdLife Australia, and I'd like to pay tribute to BirdLife as well. They've been a partner right through subsequent to the initial release, and are still involved today very much in our workflow and our data collation. Really crucial partner. In 2019, mammals were brought in to the index to release the Threatened Mammal Index, and then plant data was gathered in 2020, and the Threatened Plant Index was released. In 2021, the TSX migrated to TERN, so the TSR Hub funding came to a close, and TERN took on the TSX. They were very keen to see it continue. Today, it's co-funded by TERN and also the Federal Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. And our current objectives are to grow the data set for birds, mammals and plants, and we've just finished up our last data call and accrued some significant new data for those groups. We're building some additional functionality that improves the utility of the index for our data providers and users. And then we're looking to add more species groups. So in the next few years, we'd love to bring in amphibians, reptiles, freshwater fish. ARI has absolutely wonderful freshwater fish data sets that we'd love to bring into the index, for example, in the years ahead to make sure we're covering off on all of the groups of threatened species. The TSX today has expanded to take in 283 species. It's a really significant data set now. So we have over 19,000 time series of threatened species abundance and over 220,000 individual surveys. The map there shows our representation across Australia. We've got pretty good representation across the east and the Western Australian coast. We've got lots more gaps to fill in, and so sing out if you have any semi-arid or arid threatened species data sets. We would love to hear from you. I'm just going to briefly go through how the TSX works before moving then on to some of our Victorian data sets and show you some of the trends for Victorian species. So the TSX starts each year with a call to data providers right across the country, and these are existing data providers as well as new data providers. So we might hear a rumour that someone in the NT's got a fantastic new data set on bilbies, and we'll go and reach out to them and seek their data to include in the index. We gather up all of those raw data sets and put those into a confidential database. So of course, threatened species monitoring data is quite sensitive. In particular, the locations of this monitoring can be quite sensitive. So we have a raw database that is confidential. So if you do contribute data to the index, you can be confident that it's not going to be available to the public in its raw form. We do some data quality checks on that raw data, and then we go through a process where we process the data and we aggregate it to make these time series, basically. So we have sites and then monitoring data through time. So it might be for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and we collate that all up. So it's a nice clean time series of abundance. And when I say abundance, I actually mean a whole raft of different measures. We might have counts, we might have trapping success rates, we might have presence absence data, which gives us a reporting rate or an occurrence rate. So we actually have quite a spectrum of data that goes into the index. We then put that into an aggregated database, and that's open access. So once we've debadged the data, essentially, we make it open access. We want the TSX to be as transparent as possible. So those aggregated, de-identified data are made available through our website. We then use what's known as the Living Planet Index methodology to estimate trends for our different groups and to graph out those trends. I won't go into the LPI method today, but please get in touch if you'd like further information about how it works. You can look it up on the web. It's a methodology that was created to allow monitoring data that takes in all those different types of measures of abundance, standardises them, and can use them together to estimate multi-species trends. So we estimate the trends for all of our groups, and then at the end of our annual cycle, we upload those to the website. So you can jump on to our web portal and explore the trends for different species groups, different jurisdictions, different management types, etc. So please do jump on and have a look. Okay, so I thought I'd close out with Victorian data sets that we have and trends. So the 2020 index release, so we missed a year because of our transition to TERN, but we're just about to run through the workflow for 2022, and we'll do a release in November. So, but for 2020, we had some great Victorian data, over 68,000 surveys, almost 4,000 time series of abundance of Victorian threatened species, for 57 species in total, and some really iconic species, orange-bellied parrots, flame robins, Australasian bitterns. We have good data sets for, including from the Western Treatment Plant. In terms of mammals, we have 7 species that we have data on at the moment. That includes things like the greater glider, eastern barred bandicoot, which of course have been the focus of really extensive monitoring in Victoria over many years. And then we have plants as well. So we've got, I think, 22 plants in the index at the moment, and an example being the jumping jack wattle here from the central goldfields, and Swansena peas, for example. This is Mariana, one of the semi-arid peas species. So we've got some great data sets for some of our threatened plants as well. In terms of the trends, I'm going to just walk you through the 3 groups for Victoria. So for birds, we have 28 species, just over 3,000 time series, and those data suggest quite an extensive decline in Victorian birds since 1985. So around about a 70% decline in abundance for Victorian birds, and particularly woodland birds. For mammals, as I said, we've got 7 species currently in the index. We'd love to add more Victorian mammal species, 600 odd time series, and the trend is really stark. So almost an 80% decline in abundance for the species that we have and the data sets that we have in the index since 1985. So quite concerning trends there. For Victorian plants, the trends are even a bit more stark. So about an 85% decline in abundance since 1985 for the 22 species that we currently have in the index, and that's almost 150 time series. So you can see that there are some quite concerning trends for Victoria's threatened species. But I didn't want to deflate you too much. Hopefully you're not all sitting there deflating into your chair at the moment. The trends are quite stark, but I'll show you why there's a bit of reason for hope in a moment. But a point that I wanted to make before I move on is that whilst these trends are stark and can be quite depressing, they're also just crucial to know. We really need this objective information on trends to establish if we're solving the problem or not, and if we're not, to demonstrate the importance of more stringent protections for our threatened species, and also more investment in our threatened species. So, yeah, while these trends that we get from the index can be a bit deflating, they really are important to have to demonstrate the plight of our threatened species. And there's also other reasons to hope. So I wanted to sort of pick you up at the end here by also showing that whilst the trends that we often see in the index of decline, the index is also really crucial for demonstrating when we're succeeding. So this is critical weight range mammals within the index. Critical weight range mammals have declined very sharply across Australia, and in fact we've lost numerous members of this group. So this is mammals between 50 grams and 5 kilos. But the good news is that the data in the TSX suggests that we are starting to stabilise our critical weight range mammals. So this is all sites that we have for this group in the index. You can see stabilisation from around about the turn of the century, and that last little uptick at 2017 suggests that we're starting to, in fact, now increase the abundance in this group. And it's demonstrating that our management is working as well. So this is the trends for just managed sites. So this is where active management of critical weight range mammals is occurring. And you can see that we are, there's a lot of uncertainty there, but we are increasing the abundance of this group. So it's really crucial to have this data to demonstrate that we can succeed as well when we put investment in, when you put effort in to these groups, that we can save them. And this final plot just shows you the trends in predator-free havens, which of course we know are incredibly successful at conserving these groups. So the TSX helps us to demonstrate our successes as well, and again justify all of the great conservation activities that we are undertaking across Australia for our threatened species. Okay, I'll finish up there and just to ask you to please get involved. We're always looking for new data sets. We really want to increase the representation and representativeness of our data sets. So please do reach out. You can find us on the web, and yeah, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks very much.
Wow, thank you, Geoff. Just waiting a sec. Thank you, Geoff. That was fantastic. I'm not sure if you can hear me or not. Yes. Okay. Wow. Devastating trends, but thank you for giving us that hope at the end of some suggestions of where things work. I'm imagining a world where Australians are as aware of these trends as they are for the ASX. I'm sure you've thought about a weekly news bulletin that talks about the TSX. That level of awareness would be pretty terrific. I can see some questions in the chat, some of which mirror a couple of mine. So Andy's going to take us through the questions. Thanks, Geoff. Thanks so much. Terrific.
Yeah, excellent presentation, Geoff. And as you'd expect, there are a number of questions. The first one I'm going to go to, you mentioned that you're going to look at amphibians and aquatic freshwater species. One person's asking, what about invertebrates? Are they going to get a mention sometime soon?
A very good point. Yes, so we just had a meeting this morning, in fact, with Kate Umbers from Invertebrates Australia. So she's set up a new overarching group that are bringing together invert experts from across Australia. And so, yeah, we talked quite a bit this morning about the lack of representation of inverts and the fact that we would love to have them in the index. Yeah, so it's definitely on our radar and we will be working towards it in the next few years. The challenge for us will be the data that we can get because, yeah, our inverts have been somewhat neglected in terms of our monitoring projects. There are some really wonderful monitoring projects out there for inverts, and the freshwater crayfish, a lot of the work that Arne and co do through ARI would be an example of that. So yeah, there are great data sets out there and we would love to incorporate them. And yeah, we just need to get everyone in the room, find out where the data is and hoover it up.
Perfect. Building on that about the different types of data you need, this question is asking, how would you capture or interact the threatened species index with traditional knowledge, forms of traditional knowledge and knowledge from traditional owners?
Yeah, that's another project that we really need to launch into. So there's extensive traditional owner data sets available, particularly across Northern Australia. And at the moment we don't capture them. We would love to bring those sorts of data sets in. In some cases they are collected using fairly sort of standard ecological methods, I suppose. Camera trapping, for example, or the TO ranger groups across the north are doing lots of camera trapping work. But then there's track data sets from the central deserts, for example. So Sarah Legg's been working with TOs to to gather some of that sort of data. So yeah, so that I think there's great opportunities there, but we're going to have to think fairly deeply about it and how we can ensure the data gives us that equivalent information that we get, I suppose, from traditional ecological methods. And there's also sensitivities there, of course, as well. So we need to work through those as to yeah, making sure that we do it in the right way. That acknowledges their ownership of the data and their and make sure that we don't make it accessible to those that TOs might not want it accessible to. So yeah, there's quite a bit to work through there, but we're certainly keen to launch into it.
I'm confident you'll work through it, Geoff.
Thanks, Andy.
Final question, just because it's a great one as well. How do people ensure that their historic and future project data is being fed into the index? Things like the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas, do they automatically come to you, or do people need to get in touch directly with someone from your team to make sure it's captured in the index?
Yeah, there's a bit of both there. So we do incorporate VBA data. In fact, Taylor, our data analyst, is working through that right at the moment. So yeah, so we do get annual uploads from the VBA and also from the other atlases across the country. But then we also deal directly with data providers. So if anyone has data that they're interested in contributing, just reach out. You can find us on the web. We'd love to have a chat. We've got a process that we work through to upload the data. And likewise, if anyone is planning threatened species monitoring projects that they think could feed into the index, we'd love to chat to you as well, just to talk through your methods and hopefully ensure that that data can flow to us ultimately.
Fabulous, Geoff. Thank you so much. There's still more questions, of course, in the Q&A there. You might want to jump in and have a look while we're listening to Justin, perhaps. But thank you to you. Thank you to all of the questions. Really interesting, and it's going to be really interesting to keep watching this as it progresses. Terrific initiative. Thank you so much for letting us know. Next, we're going to hear from Justin. So Justin has been with us at ARI since about mid last year, I think. So one of those, you know, how fun is it to join an organisation when you can't actually go into the office? It's always a bit awkward, but good on Justin. We're seeing him around the Institute now. It's great to actually get to know him. He's now in our wildlife ecology group, and already he's been working on things like the abundance of deer across the state, what's happening with greater gliders in places like Wombat State Forest that were affected by all those storms, and of course what's happening with the abundance of koalas in East Gippsland. So that's what we're going to hear from Justin about today. Thanks, Justin. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Fern. So today I'll be talking about koalas in East Gippsland. So why East Gippsland? Well, it's mainly because of a knowledge gap in East Gippsland regarding the populations there. So for context, earlier this year, ARI and Deakin University conducted some surveys over in East Gippsland. We conducted these surveys to better inform regional and statewide estimates of koalas. So for this presentation, I'll be showing lots of maps, and the idea behind that is trying to walk through this narrative of what's going on with the abundance of koalas in this region. So this research isn't starting from scratch. In fact, previous work by Dave Ramsey and Geoff Heard previously conducted a statewide koala abundance models. So as you can see here from these previous surveys, which were included in the model, there's double and single counts, both diurnal and nocturnal, and they range across Victoria. However, you can probably notably see that no surveys were included from East Gippsland, or no known surveys were included from East Gippsland. So that leads to a bit of a knowledge gap in terms of what's going on with the population in East Gippsland and how much oversight we have of that population. So for context, let's zoom into East Gippsland and get our bearings coordinated. So for this study, I guess the area of focus or area of interest broadly ranges from Bairnsdale over to Mallacoota and then up to the New South Wales border. So a good first step in approaching this topic is to look at the historical records. So based on historical records from the VBA and ALA, we can see the koalas have an interesting distribution in East Gippsland. It's not necessarily uniform across the landscape, but they're not entirely absent from the landscape either. I guess when looking at koalas, it's important to keep in mind that many koala records and their distribution is actually based upon historical translocations throughout the region. So from this map, we see a decent number of translocations, especially around Bairnsdale and then even a couple over near Mallacoota. So visualising this over time, we see that initial records, initial known records occurred around Bairnsdale and Bruthen, subsequently more sightings going up through Galanthropy and then up to Tubbut near the New South Wales border, as well as records also popping over near Mallacoota, with generally a bit of a gap in the middle. So this then is the context or leads us to our first analysis step, and that was to find the suitable habitat for koalas at a statewide level, but of course keeping in mind East Gippsland. So we began this step by using presence-only models that were dependent upon climate and modelled habitat covariates. Specifically, we found that a mix of climate and modelled habitat covariates best identified suitable koala habitat in Victoria, with the predicted presence of modelled food trees and climatic factors such as temperature seasonality contributing to the model. You also see there the modelled food trees were split into high preference, medium preference and low preference eucalypt, just to account for spatial differences in occupancy and abundance of those species across a large landmass of Victoria. So using this model, we essentially based it on historical records, but these, because of historical translocations, including failed ones and changes to koala distributions over time, we only use records since 2007 to inform this model, to sort of not include areas that may once have been occupied but were no longer occupied. And this model also ran on a statewide level for completeness. So from this model, we were able to identify suitable and unsuitable habitat, keeping in mind that there'll always be some area involved in a cutoff or threshold. So we need this categorised area of suitable habitat to the extent of our abundance predictions, which I'll talk a bit about later. And the suitable areas were also the foundation of our surveys. So zooming into East Gippsland, we see that there's about 4,739 square kilometres of what our model classes as suitable habitat. That's about 1/4 of the total area of East Gippsland, an area with pretty good forest cover. So it's not necessarily a widespread suitable area for koalas, according to our model. So as I was saying before, this was essentially this suitable habitat was the foundation for our surveys in East Gippsland. So earlier this year, ARI and Deakin surveyed 39 sites within East Gippsland for koalas. Some areas were selected, again, based on areas of suitable habitat, and there's a couple slightly outside that based on on-ground assessment of habitat that may have appeared suitable. So how did we sample the area? Well, we used double observer distance sampling. Double observer distance sampling essentially makes an effort to record koala abundance at our sites. This method accounts for variable detectability of koalas the further away they are from the transect, as well as also accounting for variability between individual observers. As you can see from that GIF, this is how ideally a survey might occur, and koalas that are closer to the transect are more likely to be detected than those further away. With this knowledge, we can hopefully account for the imperfect detection rates we have of koalas and then get more robust and accurate estimates of koalas at a given site. So again, turning back to where our surveys occurred throughout East Gippsland. 39 sites throughout this region, all conducted during the day, of course. However, we also had at our disposal previous greater glider surveys in East Gippsland that ARI had conducted. So previously, these nocturnal surveys for greater gliders had detected koalas in Strathbogies and Central Highlands. And thus, they're actually quite a valuable resource for us to include in these koala models moving forward. So that essentially bumps up our total survey site number to 165. Should just be taken in note that some of those surveys were conducted before the 2020 bushfires, but all the koala surveys were conducted after those bushfires. So where did we find koalas from our surveys? Well, out of the total 165 sites, only 4 sites had koalas detected on them. And these 4 sites were part of the 39 sites that we surveyed earlier this year, specifically for koalas. So none of the greater glider sites detected koalas. Interestingly, at 2 sites, there were quite high koala density numbers recorded, so about 10 at each site at 2 sites. So that led to the total number of koalas detected at 22 for our surveys. So this lack of detections across East Gippsland really made us reconsider what we mean by occupied and unoccupied range. So the lack of detections and previous lack of incidental records gave us reason to distinguish between occupied suitable habitat and unoccupied suitable habitat for our abundance model. So to make this distinction, we generated a kernel density estimate based on the presence points since 2007 across the state and made a cutoff so that 99.5% of records fell within this estimated range. So this limits the suitable habitat area to areas with evidence of inhabitants, essentially making an assumption that not all suitable habitat is occupied, which is probably a good assumption to make for species that have had changes to range and distribution, as well as also invasive species as well. So from this, we see that only a small proportion of East Gippsland is occupied with suitable habitat, about 1/10 of it. So turning our heads to the abundance models now. Our abundance models incorporate a range of survey data, such as single counts and double count data. They allow for variable detection rates for daytime as well as nocturnal surveys. And the abundance is modelled or driven by interactions between climate and those modelled Euclid prevalence layers we showed before. Specifically, maybe 2 key takeaways in terms of what's driving koala abundance is that we found that wetter and warmer areas that have high amounts of blue gum, river red gum, or swamp gum, so those medium preference food trees, were favourable to koala abundance. Additionally, lower elevation but colder areas with manna gum, so the high preference eucalypts, are favourable for koala abundance as well. So using the output of this model, we're able to generate statewide predictions. So this is a map showing Victoria and statewide predictions across the range. So the model shows similar trends to previous work done by Dave Ramsey and Geoff Heard. However, some areas have deflated abundance estimates in our updated model. And this is essentially because we fed in a lot more zero counts and some of those areas that might have had previously say medium density estimates were a bit deflated, as well as in East Gippsland. As you can see in East Gippsland, a lot of the area, or all the area, is modelled here as low density compared to some of those high density areas, say in the southwest or Otways. If we zoom in on East Gippsland, and keeping in mind that the scale here has just changed, so it's sort of 10 times lower almost, we see that the median estimate for East Gippsland in terms of koala numbers is about 4,500. There's high uncertainty around this estimate. Again, that's the effect of having lots and lots of zero counts. So, why did we detect so few koalas in East Gippsland? Well, there's probably a few reasons, which I'll go through now and talk about, why we detected so few koalas. Firstly, it could be low density. It could also be the impact of the 2025s, as well as the lack of translocations that have occurred in the region and the reasons for those lack of translocations. And finally, also habitat suitability might be a factor in limiting the amount of koalas that we detected in East Gippsland. So the first point is that at lower densities, there's a lower probability that a koala will happen to be on the transect while you're surveying. That doesn't necessarily mean they're absent from the landscape. As you can see from the GIF, at lower densities, there will be a lower likelihood that a koala will just happen to be on the transect and available to be sampled while a survey is walking it. So if we would say simulate data for 40 transects about what we did at 1 kilometre length long and a 50-metre half strip width, so sort of around the range of what we would expect to have our transects be in the region. So if koala density is very low, say 0.01 koalas per hectare or 0.05 koalas per hectare, from those 40 transects, we would be only detecting a handful of koalas across that range. And of course, as you can see from that previous GIF, that even though we might not detect them, it doesn't entirely mean that they're absent from the area. So this then leads to the question of what is the optimal survey technique for low density populations? And there's current work being done on the suitability of, say, using drones as well as song meters to better detect koalas in these low abundance populations. Secondly, fire. So this is, again, the map of what we classed as occupied suitable habitat in East Gippsland, pockets around Bairnsdale, Bruthen, up through Galantaby, close to the border near Tubbut, and then over in the far east around Mallacoota. If we overlay the 2019-2020 bushfires on top, we see that a lot of the area is actually covered by a fire extent, varying in range, but some of it was quite high, especially around Mallacoota, and then up around Buchan as well. The severity was quite high. So that might be a reason why, again, since we conducted these surveys this year after the fires, we detected so few koalas. Thirdly, translocations may play a significant role in the abundance and distribution of koalas throughout Victoria. We say high density abundance pockets in other parts of the state really linked to historical translocations in the area. However, according to the 2004 koala management strategies, there's a few suggested restrictions on translocating koalas, and having a look at how these overlay with East Gippsland, we see that one recommendation is to not translocate individuals above 700 metres. Now for East Gippsland, this actually cuts off quite a large chunk of area that might be unsuitable for translocations. Secondly, another recommendation was not to translocate koalas from outside the paralysis tick range to within the paralysis tick range. And that purple shading there is the area that's roughly classed as the paralysis tick range. So when we add on now koala translocation since 2004, we see that there's only a couple of translocations, and all bar one are outside that range. So generally outside that restricted area. So that again might be another reason why we just don't see koala populations widespread throughout East Gippsland. Finally, another key point or key fact to consider when trying to understand the lack of detections of koalas in East Gippsland is habitat. Now, of course, the paralysis tick might be one limiting factor on distribution and abundance in East Gippsland, in that it prevents koalas from establishing large populations in East Gippsland. It seems like the Malakuta population might have resistance to that. However, apart from that, that might be a limitation on their abundance. The modelled food trees that we use to predict koala abundance might actually differ from actual abundance in some locations, and koalas can be very picky eaters, and so that might be essentially limiting their dispersal as well. So the value of the habitat according to koalas throughout that region. Finally, habitat might be too. So in certain hotspots such as Malakuta or Galanthby, if habitat quality is very good, say in a small pocket, and these food trees are very favourable, it might actually suppress dispersal to other areas. And as you can see from the photo here, in Galanthby, where an area has been heavily overbrowsed, the koalas would say prefer to stay in that one spot and just overbrowse it rather than dispersing large distances to find other food trees. So in summary, we conducted 39 surveys this year targeting koalas, but we also had a bunch of other surveys for greater gliders in East Gippsland. However, we only found koalas at 4 sites. This was fewer than previously modelled, but depending on who you ask, probably not unsurprising. So the survey methods, specifically low density or low availability, fire, as well as translocation restrictions and habitat quality might be reasons for the low number of detections. So some future and related projects to consider and link in with this is I've just made a quick list of a couple of projects that I guess have are related to this project and are good, I guess, future considerations. So firstly, there's the Victorian Koala Management Strategy. It's currently in a draft stage and it's available to look up online. There's also a CSIRO National Koala Monitoring Program, as well as work being conducted by Deakin looking at monitoring low density koala populations, say with drones. And then will probably be some also quite interesting genetics studies coming out of some of those East Gippsland populations, such as Galanthby, to try to understand sort of how it's formed and what's the composition of it. Finally, I'd just like to thank partners we worked on with this project. So Deakin University, CSIRO, and of course collaborators here at ARI. On that note, I'm happy to take any questions and yeah.
Thank you, Justin. Thanks so much for that. Super interesting, and like whenever I hear something about koalas, it answers a lot of questions, but it just raises more. They are such curious things. I have so many questions about what is going on with koalas in different circumstances. So thank you so much. That's really intriguing and interesting and really helpful to know what's happening, some of what's happening in East Gippsland. We do have a couple of questions, so I'm going to throw to Andy and just also draw your attention to everyone listening in that Andy's also popped in the chat a questionnaire about you joining us today as well as part of the Nature Festival, so please do have a look at that as well. Andy, I'll bet there's a few questions in there. How are we going?
there's a couple trickling in. The first one I'm going to ask Justin is around koala movement. Paul's asked whether or not there was any movements as part of this study, and whether the populations near the border would relate to populations in southern New South Wales.
I'm not too sure what you mean by movements of koalas, but I'll attempt to answer the second question. I think, although we didn't detect koalas up right near the border, there are records there, again, around sort of that Tubbut region on the New South Wales border. And then that flows into records in New South Wales, even around, say, Jindabyne or around that area. So, yeah, that's a big question. Is that sort of a corridor of koala that's a continuous population that's flowing from, say, Bairnsdale, Bruthen, Gillespie, Tubbut, New South Wales, or they're sort of more isolated patches, and that's sort of just why I put that dot point there on the genetics, and yeah, seeing what's the makeup of that population and how connected are they from, say, yeah, populations more in New South Wales.
Very good answer. I reckon you nailed it. I look forward to learning more about that genetic study in future. Another question, this is coming back to the habitat suitability questions. Steve's asking, does this work provide any sort of answers to why there are no koalas in Tasmania?
I would probably think, I mean, in terms of why there's no recent koalas in Tasmania, I think it's because there's probably been no translocations there. Historically, my guess probably would be on predation, but again, I'd probably need to look that up a bit further. Not the expert on koalas in Tasmania, unfortunately, or lack thereof.
All good, Justin. Last question, just sneaking for time. Do you think there's real opportunity for future translocations of koalas into East Gippsland, or do you think they would have to wait for that genetic study to find out?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, it depends on habitat suitability within that area, and obviously translocations, still there's that paralysis tick consideration to make. I do wonder, again, in taking populations from within that paralysis tick range, i.e. Malakuta, or even Gillespie, if that's still within that paralysis tick range, and translocations elsewhere, that might be a possibility. But then you also have to consider recent fire impacts as well. That has burnt a lot of suitable habitat, especially around Malakuta. So the koalas you do see around Malakuta are usually in the very small pockets of unburnt forest, because there was really high severity fires there. So I think it is about, of course, it does need a balance, where there's actually been fires as well, which will probably limit translocations even further on top of those elevation and paralysis tick layers I showed earlier.
Thank you so much, Justin, for those quick questions. We're at 2 o'clock, so I'm going to send it back to you, Fern. Thanks.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks so much, Justin. Thanks to everybody for jumping on today. Thanks to both of our speakers. Thanks to Andy for doing the tech. Please stand by for an announcement about our next seminar in October. Thanks everyone for joining in, and again, one more plug, jump into the Nature Festival and see what things you'd like to join in. And once again, big thanks to Geoff and Justin, the double J's. Woohoo! Thank you.